Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Karen Hardy, and welcome to Flip This Risk podcast, where we interview high achievers about their relationship with risk taking and how it influences their leadership abilities. You can find out more about our podcast at flipthisrisk.tv, and you can also check out our new book, Flip This Risk for conversations, 17 questions to ask about risk management when you don't know what to say. And today, my guest is Mr. Thomas Brandt. Tom is the Chief Risk Officer at the Internal Revenue Service in the U.S. Great to have you here, Tom.
My pleasure, Karen.
Indeed. So great time to talk about your organization, not just in terms of timing and a seasonal time for it, but to really look at the organization as a whole and the work you've done there for some time as it relates to enterprise risk management. Now, risk management, I would say, is very popular right now, based on the situation that we've been facing with the COVID and everything. But it's also been an opportunity, right? It's been an opportunity for organizations to take a second look at what they're doing and rethink what they're doing and think about how they're going to do things post-COVID. So it's a great chance to bring you on to talk about your organization as a whole and how you're managing and dealing with risk now and also in the future. So thank you so much for being here. And before we jump in about your role at the IRS, I didn't know that you grew up on a farm in upstate New York. Now, I've known you for some time. That never came up in our conversations, Tom. Was that a secret?
I don't know, Karen. I guess because I've lived in the DC area for so long, people assume maybe that I'm DC based. But yeah, my growing up was on a farm in upstate New York, and still have family there, and the farm is still in the family. So it is nice to be able to get up there when I'm able.
It sounds wonderful. What was it like? I mean, growing up on a farm, and in terms of what did it teach you? You know how you had those moments where you look back at your life and you see certain points of time in your life to say that really helped me learn something about myself or how I approach things. How was that for you in terms of
Yeah, well,
being
good
raised on a
question.
farm?
I think as a kid growing up on a farm, it was a lot of work. So, as a child, I probably didn't appreciate what that environment meant for me and was for me. But, as an adult looking back, and I think about, the opportunity we had to grow up, we had a farm of 200 acres. We had, lots of things to do. We had a great family. It was hard work, but I think it taught us the value of hard work and being self-sufficient. So, even though maybe as a kid I didn't appreciate it as much looking back, I realize and recognize what a great growing up experience I had.
Sometimes in your work that you do today as the chief risk officer at the IRS, do you find yourself reflections of um, that experience of working on the farm? You say it's hard work. Does it impact or influence the way you see things?
um I think part of it was you had to, because you did have to be a bit self-sufficient, but we also had to work together as a team. I had to work with my family. And you also had to plan ahead. We grew our own vegetables, raised livestock.
Hmm.
You had to kind of plan for the unknown sometimes. And so I think certainly there's
Hmm.
some role that perhaps factors into my career today. Although growing up and certainly going to college, I don't think I ever planned for a career at the IRS. But things have a way of working out. So the IRS has been a great place to work. It's afforded me excellent opportunities, and I've appreciated the chance to hopefully give back to the agency and to the government through my role, for the last 7+ years now as its chief risk officer.
That is awesome. And let's talk about your role as the chief risk officer. What exactly, tell us a little bit about what your role is in the work that you do as a CRO.
Sure. Well, I mean, part of the biggest, I think, responsibility or role is just trying to help improve decision making at the IRS by helping facilitate the consideration of risk across the organization and with top leadership, having, I think, early awareness of risks as they are perhaps occurring in the organization or being identified, providing that framework by which risk information can get in front of our leadership team, that they have a chance to understand and, deliberate over some of those risks and ultimately decide kind of what is the organization's posture going to be. We all have to accept risk, and we seek risk when we're trying to pursue opportunities. But I think the key is having an awareness of kind of what those risks are, what the different types of risks are, and then also, having in place risk response strategies so that if a risk does manifest, we've thought it through and we have some opportunities planned or prepared for how to address that.
Now, we both know that risk management is not something new, especially in the government space. Risk management is practiced in every industry, but in the government space, it's not new. Now, enterprise risk management, that's a different way of thinking about risk. And you already mentioned that the IRS already has risk on their mind. So why did the IRS need enterprise risk management?
Yeah, that's a good question too, Karen. I'd say, IRS organizations were very good at identifying risks within units. But as you know, enterprise, and I think what the benefit and the value that enterprise risk management brings is being able to look at risks across the organization, kind of put the pieces together sometime that might not be identified if a risk is only being looked at in a single area. And also, I think that recognition of how, a risk that could arise in one area, the impacts that could occur in other parts of the organization, were that to manifest. The other, I think, benefit too from taking an enterprise view is making sure the top leadership has awareness of those risks that might be percolating within, particular parts of the organization, and maybe bringing the right people together to help better manage or better address a risk. Sometimes I think we take great pride in trying to fix our own problems and,
Oh, yeah.
not elevating stuff out of concern that, well, I'm in this job to fix things, perhaps. But, sometimes we reach out to our peers. They can actually provide help. They can give us maybe insight into additional solutions and certainly sometimes intervene early enough to prevent, say, a risk from turning into an issue or a crisis.
It's very important. You mentioned in terms of, the way you manage your risk can impact someone else within the organization. And I like that because enterprise risk management, it's not just about elevating a risk, it's about having relationships with people, right? Within your organization, relationships with other people in the C-suite, the unit managers, directors, supervisors, and getting a sense of understanding what their pain points are and how you manage your risk can impact them. But also, as you mentioned before, those best practices. We're not superheroes in this space. And we certainly seen that because of how dynamic risk is now. You definitely can't be a superhero or just one individual trying to resolve a problem. It takes a village in a sense.
Yeah, you need to build the team. And I think the point you raised, Karen, about relationships, building those relationships, establishing those relationships so that one, people feel comfortable reaching out to you when, maybe there's a concern or a risk that they want to talk about or they want to get your insight on. But then on the flip side too, that, you're able to reach out to them when there's maybe something you've heard about or learned about that, you think, well, maybe this is something that has enterprise impact and that we need to be, bringing before the risk committee and reaching out and saying, I hear this is going on. Can you tell me a little bit about this? Is there a way we can help? Should we get, other parts of the organization involved? And do that in a way that, isn't threatening to anybody. I'm not, as chief risk officer reaching out because, I'm, trying to shine the spotlight per se on anything, but really just trying to understand, is there a way to help? And is this something we need to get ahead of now before perhaps it takes a turn that could catch, parts of the organization off guard?
Oh, definitely. That's the way of thinking. I was going to say the new way of thinking. Well, it's a renewed way of thinking, right? In terms of how we get ahead of things before they happen,
Yeah.
right? And the word culture has been tossed around a lot. People, you heard of the famous saying in terms of culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? But so what is the relationship of culture in terms of enterprise risk management? What does that has that looked like for you in the organization, just from your experience?
Yeah. Well, I think the most critical factor about making ERM or enterprise risk management work in an organization is it needs to be done in a way that considers the organization's culture.
Hmm.
And you and I have talked about this before. You just can't take the ERM framework from one organization and plop it into another. You do need to tailor it, based on how your organization operates, how it's structured,
Yeah.
your history, and your culture. And then a big part of introducing ERM and promoting ERM is trying to make sure that you're creating that culture where everybody in the organization feels comfortable raising concerns, sharing risks, that and that we as managers or executives, we're listening to our employees, we're listening to our colleagues, and we're carefully considering that information and then doing something with it. I think the shortcoming sometimes is we've got risk processes in place where people raise things, but then it's not clear, well, what happens with it? Maybe folks don't hear back. So, the culture piece is we need to create that culture where everybody feels comfortable raising risks, and then that we as managers and executives are taking action and then closing the loop and reporting back.
Hmm.
And so I'd say, from that aspect, having that open environment is critical to making ERM work in any organization.
In all fairness, it's not unusual for organizations and people within organizations to push back if they don't understand. So it's not unusual to have a culture that may not be totally ready for enterprise risk management, but with some understanding, training, communication, and relationships, and closing the loop in terms of helping people understand what is the purpose and what's the end game for instituting enterprise risk management. Just don't leave them out there hanging, wondering what it is, but actually give them some firm direction.
Yeah, and that relationship has to develop over time. Folks
Yeah.
need to understand, well, if I share this information, how is it going to be used? How are you going to help me? And then they need to have that experience to see, well, does this indeed play out the way that you indicated it would?
Right.
Um, so build that trust, and then over time, I think the relationship expands from there.
Yeah. And you won't always have 100% buy-in, even though that's ideal, but you get buy-in from the right people at the right time. And it's amazing what, a small percentage of people can have in terms of influence within the organization. So Internal Revenue Service is a service organization. Also, you're just not looking at internal risk and how things operate within your organization, but the taxpayer, right? Servicing the taxpayer. So let's talk about the taxpayer. What are some of the biggest risks that taxpayers are facing?
Karen, I think unfortunately we are still just seeing way too much fraud
Mm,
occurring in the environment. And the fraudsters just seem to, continually be refining the approach they take to try to compromise people and fool people and scam people. And so we are, always spending a lot of time trying to work with partners and, with other organizations, to the media, et cetera, to make taxpayers aware of the different types of fraudulent schemes that are out there so that they don't fall victim to them or become, fall prey to that. I think the challenge, of course, in the last year with all of the relief, economic relief and economic payments, et cetera,
hmm.
that have been provided because of the pandemic, that has created new opportunities for the fraudsters to take advantage of people
Right.
who are in, difficult situations. And if you're struggling and waiting for that economic impact payment and you get a text saying, well, to confirm your payment, enter your bank information here, they take enough steps to try to make it appear authentic that it can perhaps confuse people or expose them to fraud. And so I think, unfortunately, that is one of the biggest risks continuing in this environment now is the potential for taxpayers to be duped,
Hmm.
and then to suffer, financial consequences because of that.
Fraud risk may be a risk that's elevated by a lot of different types of organizations right now, right? That could be susceptible to that. That's definitely one of those risks that needs to be elevated, or maybe elevated on the risk profile for a lot of, industries and organizations.
Yeah.
So that's good to know that, the taxpayers need to be aware and keep their eye out for fraud. So in terms of other tax organizations as a whole, what are the biggest risks in general and across the globe? I know that you've had some experience overseas in Paris, and you've had the chance to interact with a lot of global individuals in the same space as yourself.
Yeah, so I, have done work with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and their Forum on Tax Administration, which brings together, tax agencies from around the world to try to advance, tax administration and really, I think, help us all identify good practice and work through sort of some of those common challenges. But when we, interact with our colleagues and ask sort of what is the top risk that you're facing from a tax administration perspective, that tends to center on compliance, on either the level of compliance or the increasing non-compliance. That's tax evasion, tax avoidance. And we think about, even in this period of time when governments are perhaps strained for resources and we're being called upon to deliver, more relief to citizens and businesses, that has to come from somewhere. And
Mm-hmm.
if the tax system is being compromised through tax evasion or tax avoidance, that creates significant risk. And, no surprise, Karen, within the United States, tax enforcement has been, on the GAO high risk list, I think, since its inception.
Right.
Uh, and we look at, estimates like the tax gap, which suggests that upwards of $500 billion goes unpaid every year in the United States because of, non-reporting and tax evasion and tax avoidance. So, that the U.S. isn't alone in that being probably one of the biggest risks to tax administration.
Absolutely. And there's a new report out, I believe, document released from the OECD that talks about some of the challenges for tax organizations, correct?
Yeah, I've certainly been sharing information on the top risk, but what the OECD recently came out with was a maturity model
Mm.
for ERM in tax administration. And I think through the work that's been done with the Forum on Tax Administration, there are, the ERM is being practiced globally, and embraced by tax administrations. The OECD has provided a forum for those organizations to share, what they're doing and how they're approaching it. And I think there's been interest in being able to compare, individual tax administration approaches with global standards. And so the OECD, through the Forum on Tax Administration, developed this maturity model that kind of gives you a way to measure your current approach to leading practices and also aspirational approaches. There
Mm-hmm.
are obviously areas we are all aspiring to grow towards. And I think this model complements other work the OECD has done in areas of tax debt and compliance, and also even reputational risk is
Mm-hmm.
something that's been looked at in the past as well.
That is awesome to hear, your explanation and description of what that looks like in terms of with other tax organizations. And I can't help but wonder and step back and think about, again, your experience being raised on a farm and both of us coming as chief risk officers, understanding that farming is part of the job as a CRO in terms of, you're cultivating an environment where you're creating these relationships, and the outcome you're hoping is something is a product that everyone can use. That's pretty
Mhm.
much synonymous with the farming. I was just thinking about that for the most part. So in terms of the future, let's talk about the future, Tom, a little bit. I was watching a show on TV today, and it was a interview about restaurants, right? And what that looks like, what that industry is going to look like after this challenge that we're facing right now, and the post COVID. And a lot of the owners were saying that it may not be the same restaurant or industry that we knew before. They're going to be changes to cooking techniques and systems and supply chains, and so there's a lot of change coming. So with that in mind, what does the future of the IRS look like?
Well, when we think about what we've all gone through and how organizations have responded to the pandemic, the IRS, of course, has had to, try to shift as quickly as possible in a number of channels to providing digital services and increasing, our ability to work remotely, not only as a workforce, but with taxpayers. And I think, Karen, that and we've had these conversations before. The IRS has been challenged in the past 10 years over resources. We've been
Mhm.
asked to deliver so much but in a period where our resources have been constrained. And so even though IRS has sought to move much more quickly into the digital, space, we've been challenged because of, I think, constraints on resources. But
Mhm.
because of the pandemic and the recognition that IRS is positioned to provide economic relief or assist in providing economic relief to businesses and taxpayers, Congress did appropriate additional resources to the IRS that we've used to expand our digital offerings, to increase the ways in which we can interact remotely. So I think that has moved us ahead in ways that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. But even in terms of what else is on the horizon, the Congress, had passed the Taxpayer First Act in 2019, which required the IRS to come up with a plan for reorganizing and restructuring how we operate,
Mm.
focusing on improving service to taxpayers and increasing efficiency and kind of enhancing our overall operations. And so that report was actually delivered to Congress in January. It does provide an outline for how we envision our organizational structure going forward. And so IRS is already starting to implement some new components, including setting up a taxpayer experience office. But there's other elements that will come into play over time. Some of those require a waiting period for any congressional input. But I
Mhm.
think you'll see in this year and definitely then ramping up into next, some
Yeah.
significant changes in the way in which the IRS is organized and how we deliver service to taxpayers.
That's excellent that the IRS has a lot of big plans ahead to think about those types of things. I would assume other organizations are thinking about the same thing. We're in this position where we felt the pain of the situation we've been in, but we've also started to realize opportunities to do better as we move forward. And definitely the IRS is sounds like it's positioned to actually do that. So we're pretty much going to wrap up the interview. Tom, did you have any last words or thoughts that you want to share with the audience as we wrap up?
I think just that the key benefit that ERM can provide, and I think is provided to us, is it is that way to get insight into kind of what are some of the risks that could impact the achievement of your objectives or your mission. So in the work you're trying to carry out, what are those things that need to go right? What are some of those things that could go wrong? And getting a sense around those risks, and then putting in place strategies or responses to help either lessen the chance that those things will occur if they're negative outcomes, or increase the likelihood that positive things will occur. And overall, just engaging the organization in that journey, and as a chief risk officer, helping the leadership team have the information they need to make good decisions. I think we've all seen through this last year this unprecedented scale of risk occur. But
Hmm.
when you look at how organizations have responded, I think organizations have taken those practices of managing risk, acting quickly,
Hmm.
but then also balancing kind of the need to act quickly with also trying to minimize the negative consequences that can sometimes occur when perhaps we do move too fast.
Oh, that's excellent. And now that we have this empirical research in terms of enterprise risk management in real time, where everyone is facing the same, isn't that amazing? Everyone's facing the same risk at the same time, and really, dusting off those mitigation plans, and hopefully instituting enterprise risk management, make it an active part of their organization. That's something that's compliance driven. And that's something because someone told you to check the box, but leaders see the need for this to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll have the chance, Karen, when hopefully the pandemic is behind us, to look back at how organizations were responded, which organizations were most resilient. And I suspect that we'll see that those organizations that had really strong risk management practices in place
Hmm.
were able to pivot quickly and recover quickly from kind of the initial impacts of the pandemic, and regroup in a way that allowed them to continuing to deliver on their mission in a period of really difficult, I think, circumstances that we were all have been faced with.
Very difficult circumstances, but also perfect time to test the strength of what we're advocating and how much it can be a benefit to everyone. Before I let you go, I must ask the question, do you think you'll go back to farming?
No, it's great to go visit, but no, I'm not interested in probably going back in time. No, thanks. But it certainly, as a way to grow up, it certainly instilled some great life lessons, Karen.
Excellent. I had to ask that question. But listen, Tom, I want to thank you so much for your time and for being with us today to talk about the Internal Revenue Service and your role as the Chief Risk Officer. And I want to thank everyone else for watching and tuning in today on Flip This Risk podcast. I'm Dr. Karen Hardy, and we'll catch you next time.
Take care.